Have you ever held something in your hands that didn't belong to you, yet somehow felt like it was meant for you? A girl once opened a dusty library book and found a love letter, unsigned, unsent, unfinished, and that single forgotten piece of paper changed her entire life. The moment she discovered the letter was as ordinary as any afternoon in the library. Yet something about it felt different from the very beginning. She had gone there only to find a reference book for an assignment, a routine she had repeated countless times. The library was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't merely settle around you but sinks in, making you aware of every soft breath and every page turned in the distance. As she pulled a slightly worn novel from the shelf, she noticed a faint crackle from inside its pages. It wasn't the crisp rustle of paper bound with the book. It was the delicate whisper of something loose, unexpected. When a folded piece of paper slipped out and drifted to the floor, she felt an odd jolt, as if life had nudged her with a story she wasn't meant to ignore. She bent down to pick it up, expecting perhaps a scribbled library note, a forgotten bookmark, or someone's careless doodle. But the moment her fingers brushed the paper, she felt the texture, softened at the edges, creased delicately down the center, as if someone had folded and unfolded it many times before making the final decision to hide it away. Curiosity bloomed in her chest. There was no title, no clear indication of its purpose, but the first line, visible through the slightly translucent fold, pulled her in instantly. I never found the courage to say this out loud. Those words alone were enough to make her heart shift. They were not merely information. They were emotion, pressed carefully between lines of ink. Suddenly, the library was no longer just a place of study. It had become the doorway to a secret someone had once held close. She hesitated before opening it fully. There was a sense of intrusion, as if she were about to step into someone's private world. And yet, something told her that this letter was not meant to stay hidden forever. When she finally unfolded it, she saw handwriting, slightly slanted, beautifully imperfect, carrying the pulse of a real person behind every curve of the pen. The letter was a confession of love, soft, aching words meant for someone who clearly never received them. There were descriptions of stolen glances, shared laughter, quiet moments that the writer had held onto long after they'd passed. Every sentence held something tender, something sincere. The girl felt as if she were reading a heart, beat raw, vulnerable, and unfinished. What struck her most was not just the letter itself, but the emotion woven into its silence. This letter had never been sent. It had never reached the person it was written for. It carried love that had never been spoken, a truth sealed instead of shared. The very thought of someone writing such beautiful words only to tuck them away in a library book stirred something deep within her. She found herself imagining the person behind the pen, someone who felt deeply but remained hidden, someone whose courage had faltered at the last moment. She wondered what kind of pain or fear could compel a person to bury their feelings instead of letting them breathe. It was not merely a love letter. It was a story paused mid-sentence. As she read it again, slowly this time, she began to notice the small details, the hesitant pauses between lines, the subtle corrections, the way certain words were pressed darker into the paper, as if the writer had felt them with particular intensity. It felt almost as though the writer had poured their soul into the page without ever expecting anyone to read it. She realized then that discovering the letter wasn't just a coincidence. It felt purposeful, as though life had placed it in her hands at exactly the right moment. She sensed that this letter was not simply a forgotten message. It was an invitation, not to meddle, but to wonder, not to pry, but to understand. The unexpected discovery shifted her entire day, her thoughts, and eventually her direction. She could have put the letter back, ignored the questions rising inside her, and carried on with her assignment, but she didn't. Something about the quiet ache in those words made her feel responsible for them, as if she couldn't let them remain lost. It felt unfair that such sincere feelings had been abandoned between pages that no one might open for years. The girl knew that this one small discovery, this fragile paper hidden in a forgotten book, had the power to change something, even if she didn't yet know what. And in that moment, standing between shelves shadowed with stories, she felt the first spark of a journey she hadn't chosen, but one that somehow felt chosen for her. The true weight of the letter settled on her only after she had read it several times, letting each sentence echo in the silence of the library. What struck her wasn't merely what the writer had said, but what they hadn't. These were words meant to change something in someone's life, words crafted with trembling honesty, yet they had never reached their destination. That contradiction alone held a strange and heartbreaking power. Unsent words carry their own kind of gravity. They are fragile, yet heavy, lingering in an emotional limbo where they are both brave and unfinished. As she traced the handwriting with her fingertips, she realized she was holding an entire universe of emotion that had remained untouched, unseen, and unheard. It made her wonder just how many confessions remain locked away in drawers, hearts, and overlooked places like this. There was a kind of loneliness inside the letter, not the loneliness of a person who had been rejected, but of one who had never even tried. The writer had poured everything into those lines: affection, admiration, longing, the quiet hope of being understood. Yet something had made them pull back at the final moment, sealing their truth away instead of sending it into the world. The girl sensed that this hesitation was more than fear of refusal. It was fear of exposure. After all, spoken feelings can be denied or dismissed, but written words remain, carved into permanence, and maybe that was why the writer chose not to deliver it. They might have been terrified that once the letter left their hands, it would no longer belong to them. It would belong to the person who read it, and perhaps to fate itself. The thought made her heart tighten. She began to imagine the moments that must have led to the writing of such a letter. The countless drafts, the restless nights, the emotional buildup that finally spilled onto the paper. She pictured the writer sitting alone at a desk, maybe with a lamp flickering softly, their pen hovering over the page as they struggled to put their heart into words. Perhaps they paused after nearly every sentence, debating whether their honesty was too much or too little. And when the letter was finally finished, maybe they held it with trembling hands, wondering if this single piece of paper had the power to change everything. It saddened her to think that someone could gather so much emotional courage, only to tuck it away in the pages of a book where it would remain untouched for who knows how long. But what moved her most deeply was the strange, paradoxical power of those unsent words. Despite never reaching the intended recipient, the letter still carried impact, only now it affected someone the writer never imagined. The girl felt as though the letter spoke not only of a lost opportunity, but also of universal human vulnerability. Everyone, at some point, has held back from expressing something essential. Everyone has swallowed words that felt too dangerous, too precious, or too uncertain. The girl sensed that the letter wasn't just a forgotten confession. It was a mirror held up to the countless moments when fear outweighs hope. And in that realization, she felt connected to the unknown writer in a way that surprised her. Their unspoken truth resonated with parts of her she hadn't examined closely before. She pondered how much meaning exists in what is never said. People often speak of the power of words that are shared, declared love, heartfelt apologies, bold statements. But there is another kind of power in the words that remain silent, the ones that hover at the edge of expression. The girl realized that these unsent words, preserved in ink but never released, held a deeper emotional imprint precisely because they were never acted upon. They captured a moment of vulnerability frozen in time, untouched by response or consequence. They were pure, unaltered by rejection or acceptance, just a raw fragment of a heart that had chosen to hide instead of reveal. And somehow, that made them even more haunting. The more she thought about it, the more she felt compelled to understand the story behind the silence. What circumstances kept the writer from sending the letter? Who was the person it was meant for? And above all, what became of the feelings that were never delivered? As these questions swirled in her mind, she felt a tug that went beyond curiosity. It felt like a responsibility, a strange sense that these unsent words were calling out, not to be completed or corrected, but simply to be acknowledged, to be seen. And standing there with the fragile paper in her hands, she realized she might be the first person to ever witness this hidden truth, giving those quiet, concealed emotions a chance to breathe after being trapped in silence for so long. At first, her curiosity felt simple, natural, almost casual. She found something unusual, so of course she wondered about it. Anyone in her place would have felt that quick spark of interest, that instinctive desire to know more. But as she stood there holding the letter, her curiosity didn't fade the way momentary fascinations usually do. Instead, it deepened, rooted itself, and began to grow inside her. She tried to go back to reading the book she had originally come to find, but her eyes kept drifting back to the folded paper beside her. It felt as if she had stepped into the beginning of a story, and some invisible force refused to let her close the first page. What started as a tiny question, "Who wrote this?" slowly began to multiply into dozens more. Soon, she realized she wasn't just curious about the letter. She was drawn into the emotional world of the writer. As she left the library that day, she kept replaying parts of the letter in her mind, hearing the voice of the writer in the rhythm of their sentences. Their words didn't feel distant or anonymous. They felt alive. The sincerity in them wrapped itself around her thoughts, refusing to let go. She found herself wondering what kind of person could write so tenderly, and what life they must be living now. Were they still quietly in love with the person they had written to? Had they moved on? Had they regretted not sending the letter? Or had they convinced themselves it was better that way? The more she thought about it, the more she felt that this writer wasn't just a stranger. They were someone who had left a piece of themselves behind, a piece she had accidentally stumbled upon, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't meant to ignore it. By the next day, curiosity had already begun its slow transformation into something more intentional. When she returned to the library to return another book, she found herself glancing toward the same aisle, wondering whether the writer had left any more traces behind. Maybe there had been other letters, other pages of emotion scattered unknowingly throughout the shelves. She checked the inside covers, flipped through random books, and paid more attention than usual to the people who were reading nearby. Every face suddenly had potential. Every pair of hands holding a book could have been the hands that once penned those vulnerable lines. What intrigued her wasn't simply finding answers. It was the way the search made her more aware, more engaged with the world around her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was part of a mystery that mattered, even if she didn't yet know why. The shift from curiosity to purpose wasn't something she chose consciously. It arrived slowly, quietly, like the way dawn light fills a room before the sun actually rises. Each time she read the letter again, she noticed something new, a different tone in a sentence, a hint of personality in a phrase, a unique rhythm in the handwriting. The more she discovered, the more she felt compelled to uncover the whole truth. It wasn't enough just to wonder who had written the letter. She needed to understand the person behind it. She wanted to know what inspired that depth of emotion, what held them back from delivering it, and why the letter ended up abandoned between forgotten pages. And with each question she asked, she felt her purpose solidifying, becoming clearer. This was no longer a passing curiosity. It had become something she felt responsible for resolving. Her purpose took on an even deeper meaning when she realized how personally the letter was affecting her. It didn't just spark interest. It stirred something within her that she hadn't expected. She began to reflect on her own unspoken emotions, her own moments of hesitation, her own fears about revealing too much of herself. The letter made her confront parts of her heart she had tucked away, parts she had avoided examining closely. And realizing that the writer had experienced the same vulnerability made her feel connected to them in a way she couldn't explain. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a journey that mirrored her own emotional landscape. The purpose she felt wasn't just to find the writer. It was to honor the courage it took them to write something so honest, even if they never sent it. As days passed, her purpose became a quiet guiding force, shaping her actions without her fully realizing it. She started asking librarians discreet questions about old donations and forgotten notes found in returned books. She noticed patterns in the handwriting and wondered if she might someday recognize it on a library note card or a class bulletin board. She kept the letter safely in her bag, as if it were a compass leading her somewhere she needed to go. Though she didn't yet know what she would do when she found the writer, or even if she ever would, she knew that the search was no longer optional. It had become something meaningful, something that called to her in a way she couldn't ignore. Her curiosity had grown roots, and those roots had quietly, steadily transformed into purpose. There was something about the letter that made her pause, not because it was beautifully written, but because it was honest in a way people rarely allow themselves to be. The writer had peeled back layers of their heart with no guarantee that anyone would ever see it. The more she studied their words, the more she realized she wasn't just reading a confession. She was witnessing an act of emotional courage. In a world where people often hide behind brief messages, guarded conversations, and half-expressed feelings, this letter was something different. It was vulnerable, tender, and fearlessly sincere, and that sincerity began to teach her something she had not expected to learn: that vulnerability is not weakness, but a quiet kind of bravery that demands to be felt. As she read deeper into the letter, she found herself drawn to the way the writer expressed their affection, not with dramatic declarations or exaggerated promises, but with small, thoughtful details. They had noticed the way the person they loved tucked their hair behind their ear when they were nervous, the way their laughter softened when they were tired, the way they always held their books close to their chest as if protecting something delicate. These observations weren't grand gestures. They were intimate truths that only someone who truly cared would notice. The girl found herself moved by the writer's attentiveness, realizing that real love often exists in the quiet spaces between moments, not in the loud, performative expressions people usually chase. The writer had understood this, and that understanding became one of her first lessons. But the vulnerability of the letter was not only in what the writer expressed, it was also in what they feared. Between the lines, she sensed hesitation, uncertainty, and self-doubt. There were sentences that felt like they had been rewritten multiple times, small ink smudges where the pen had lingered too long, as if the writer was battling their own nerves. Their fears were not dramatic, they were painfully human. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of breaking a friendship, the fear of ruining something precious by revealing too much. The girl realized that the writer had laid bare not only their affection, but also their insecurities. And in doing so, they had given her an insight she hadn't recognized before. Vulnerability is most powerful when it is imperfect. It does not need to be polished or confident. It just needs to be true. What surprised her most was how much she saw herself reflected in the writer's uncertainty. She had always thought of vulnerability as something dangerous, something to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. She had protected herself from heartbreak by staying silent, by holding back emotions she thought were too fragile to survive the outside world. But the letter made her question that logic. If the writer could be this open, this brave, without expecting anything in return, then perhaps vulnerability wasn't about risk, it was about authenticity. It was about being human. She realized that the courage it took to write such a letter was something she herself had never allowed herself to embrace. The writer wasn't just confessing love. They were showing her that opening one's heart could be an act of strength. As she reflected on the letter, it became a kind of mirror for her own inner world. She began thinking about moments in her life when she had held back, times when she wanted to say something meaningful, but swallowed the words instead. She remembered friendships she had outgrown because she never expressed what she truly felt, opportunities she had missed because she remained silent. Reading the writer's vulnerable confession made her confront the realization that unspoken truths can shape a life just as powerfully as the ones we dare to express. She found herself learning not only from the writer's courage, but from their hesitation as well. Their vulnerability revealed the cost of silence and the beauty of honesty. The more she learned from the writer, the more she felt herself changing. The letter was no longer just a forgotten expression of someone else's love. It had become a lesson she was carrying with her every day. She started paying attention to the small emotional details in her own life, moments she would have ignored before. She began opening up more, even if only slightly, to people around her. She found herself wanting to live more authentically, to express more truthfully, to feel more deeply. And although she didn't yet fully understand why, she knew the writer had awakened something inside her. Their vulnerability had reached across time and distance to touch her heart in a way she never expected. And that, more than anything else, made her determined to find the person behind the words, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of gratitude for the lessons their honesty had already begun to teach her. In the beginning, she thought her search for the writer was a simple mission: find the person who wrote the letter, return it, and perhaps uncover a small, sweet story behind it. But the more she searched, the more she realized she wasn't just looking for someone else. She was starting to discover parts of herself she hadn't explored before. Each clue she followed, each question she asked, and each possibility she considered slowly revealed layers of her own heart. What she originally believed was a journey outward gradually shifted into a journey inward. It was as if the letter had opened a door she didn't know existed, one that led not just to the writer's truth, but to her own hidden emotions, fears, and hopes. She began to notice how the search was changing her. The girl who once avoided emotional risk now found herself deeply invested in understanding a complete stranger's feelings. She spent long hours imagining the writer's world, their thoughts, their reasons, and in doing so, she unknowingly reflected on her own. She realized that she, too, had emotions she had tucked away, feelings she had been afraid to express. She remembered moments when she had longed for someone to understand her, but chose silence instead of honesty. The writer's courage to feel deeply, even in secret, made her question her own choices. What had she hidden from herself? What had she been too afraid to put into words? The search, she realized, was gently urging her to confront the answers. As the days passed, the journey became less about finding a face and more about finding clarity. She noticed that the letter had awakened desires within her, desires for connection, for openness, for a kind of emotional transparency she had never allowed herself before. She found herself imagining conversations she might have had if she had been braver in the past. She wondered how many opportunities she had lost because she chose comfort over vulnerability. The search made her understand that she had spent years protecting herself from emotional uncertainty, building quiet walls without ever realizing how high they had become. And now, piece by piece, the letter was pulling those walls down. The search, she saw, wasn't just guiding her forward. It was gently pulling her inward, urging her to rediscover her own emotional landscape. Even the smallest moments in her search began to feel meaningful. When she walked through the library, her eyes scanning every detail, she found herself thinking more deeply about the kind of person she wanted to be. When she asked librarians and classmates questions, she noticed her own voice becoming steadier, more confident, as if the search was helping her find a courage she hadn't known she possessed. When she read the letter again and again, she found new echoes of herself in the writer's vulnerability. The journey was transforming her from someone who simply wondered into someone who truly felt. And with every step, she sensed that she was no longer moving solely toward the writer's story. She was moving toward her own truth as well. Perhaps the most unexpected shift came when she realized she was no longer searching only for answers. She had begun searching for meaning. Every possibility she uncovered made her reflect on what she herself valued: sincerity, emotional depth, honesty, connection. Every clue she considered made her think about what she had been missing in her own life. And every time she followed a trail that led nowhere, she found herself learning something new about patience, about resilience, about the beauty of uncertain paths. The journey wasn't linear, it wasn't predictable, but it was transforming her, teaching her how to feel without fear, how to hope without hesitation, and how to let her heart guide her more than her doubts. By the time she realized how far she had come, the search had already become something much bigger than she had imagined. It was no longer just about the writer of the letter. It had become a journey of self-discovery, one that allowed her to explore her own emotional depths, her own longings, her own quiet desires for connection and authenticity. The writer's lost confession had become a map, not just leading her through the city, the library, or different people's memories, but through the unexplored corners of her own heart. And though she didn't know where the journey would take her next, she sensed now that finding the writer might answer questions she didn't even know she had, and perhaps reveal truths she had never had the courage to face before. From the very beginning, she knew the letter had entered her life by chance, a misplaced page in a forgotten book, waiting quietly for someone, anyone to find it. But as the days passed, and her connection to the writer deepened through the emotions they had left behind, she started to sense that chance alone could not explain the strange pull she felt. There was something almost intentional in the way the letter had resurfaced, as if the universe had placed it in her hands at a moment when she was ready, not just to read someone else's vulnerability, but to confront her own. This feeling grew stronger with every step she took in her search. She realized that while chance had started the story, it was her own choices that were shaping its direction. She could have left the letter in the library, dismissed it as something sweet but irrelevant to her life. She could have read it once and forgotten about it. She could have chosen silence like the writer once did, but she didn't. She chose to hold on to it. She chose to return to the library the next day. She chose to ask questions, to follow clues, to let her heart care about someone she had never met. And it was in these small, deliberate choices that she began to understand the way chance and choice intertwine. Chance opens the door, but choice is what allows us to walk through it. The letter was a coincidence. Her journey wasn't. Every decision she made pulled her closer to a feeling she hadn't expected. The quiet, budding belief that this story might be hers too. The more she searched, the more she began to recognize this subtle truth. She wasn't just following the trace of someone else's forgotten love. She was creating room for something new inside herself. Her steps were driven by curiosity, yes, but also by something softer, something tender that she couldn't quite name yet. Though she had never seen the writer's face, she felt connected to their honesty, to the way they saw the world, to the gentleness in their descriptions and the courage in their writing. She found herself imagining them not as a stranger, but as someone whose heart she had already begun to understand without ever hearing their voice. And in this unexpected connection, she realized that love doesn't always begin with presence. Sometimes it begins with understanding. She also discovered that love is rarely a single moment. It is a series of decisions, each one building upon the last. When she traced the handwriting again, choosing to see it not as evidence but as expression, she felt a softness bloom inside her. When she followed potential clues even when they led nowhere, she felt a determination she didn't know she possessed. When she reread the letter late at night, allowing herself to feel the emotion woven into the ink, she felt her heart opening in quiet, cautious ways. Each moment was a choice, and each choice brought her closer to the truth. She wasn't simply searching for the writer anymore. She was beginning to feel something for them, something she couldn't deny, no matter how unreasonable or unexpected it seemed. Slowly, she began to understand how love often lives in the space between accident and intention. The letter had landed in her hands without warning, but everything afterward, every emotion, Every reflection, every step forward, belonged to her. She wasn't falling because fate pushed her. She was falling because she allowed herself to see the beauty in the writer's vulnerability, because she let the letter touch her, because she chose to listen to the quiet voice inside her that told her this journey mattered. And that realization changed something fundamental in the way she understood love. It showed her that love is not just something that finds you. It's something you choose to recognize, to nurture, to follow, even when the path is uncertain. As she continued her search, she carried this understanding with her like a soft, steady light. She no longer felt as though she had stumbled into someone else's story. Instead, she felt like she was walking into a chapter that had been waiting for her all along. The letter had started as a mystery, a fragment of someone else's unspoken heart. But through the choices she made, it had become something deeply personal, something transformative. And though she didn't yet know what awaited her at the end of her search, she sensed that whatever she found would not simply be the end of someone's unsent love, but the beginning of something shaped equally by chance and by the choices she had made along the way. When she finally found the writer, it wasn't in the dramatic, cinematic way she had once imagined. There was no sudden spotlight, no grand revelation, just a quiet meeting in a quiet place, where two people who had unknowingly shared the same story finally stood face to face. And what surprised her most wasn't the shock of recognition or the rush of emotion, but the calmness she felt, as if her heart had known this moment long before her mind did. The writer, startled to see his unsent words returned to him, expected embarrassment or judgment. Instead, he was met with a kind of gentle understanding that softened every fear he carried. She told him how the letter had found her, how it had changed her, how it had guided her through corners of her own heart she had never dared to explore. And as he listened, he realized that his vulnerability, once hidden away out of fear, had been the very thing that brought her to him. Their conversation that day was simple, honest, unguarded. Two people speaking not as strangers, but as souls who had already met between lines of ink. The confession he never sent became the beginning of a truth neither of them had expected. She had gone searching for the writer of a forgotten love letter, never imagining she would begin to care for the person behind it. He had once tucked away his feelings, afraid they weren't enough, never imagining they would someday guide someone directly to him. And in that quiet moment, something shifted, not with fireworks, but with clarity. She understood that love doesn't always arrive in the ways we plan. Sometimes it enters our lives disguised as coincidence, tucked into old pages, waiting patiently for the right hands to find it. And sometimes, what begins as a search for answers becomes a journey towards someone whose heart feels strangely, beautifully familiar. Her story didn't end with the discovery of the letter's author. It began there, with a shared smile, a shared truth, and the quiet realization that the words he once feared to send had finally reached exactly where they were meant to be.